All right, we are up and on and participants are coming on. Welcome everybody. And Nora Serbaugh will get us started here in just a few minutes.
Okay, I'll give it a minute.
Sure.
And allow people to spill into the meeting, as it were. This is like opening the doors.
Exactly, exactly. But welcome to those of you just coming on. You're in the right place. We'll get started here in just a moment. We have a very good sign up for today. I would bet we're over 100 registrants.
Oh, lovely.
Terrific.
Lovely.
Nice.
Hi, everybody. We'll get started soon here. To those of you who are just coming on, the numbers are up, 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 going up. It's always kind of funny to watch those come in. Welcome to those of you who are just here and waiting. We'll get started here in just a few moments. We want to make sure we have a few more people in. And Nora Serbaugh from Hardy Plant Society will get us started here soon. I'm actually glad it's not as nice a day as it was Friday and yesterday. So hopefully more people are wanting to be in from their gardens to watch this today. Hello to those of you just joining in. We'll get started here in just a minute. Nora, I would say whenever you want to go, it looks like the numbers of those coming on are kind of plateaued at the moment. I'm sure they'll keep coming on, but.
All right, well, then let's get started because they don't really want to hear me. They are signed up to hear Tony Aiello. So I'll make this quick. Hi, everybody. For those who don't know me, I am Nora Serbaugh, the current president of the Hardy Plant Society, the Mid-Atlantic Group. And we're so pleased to welcome everyone here today. This whole program represents a core principle of Hardy Plant, which is collaboration. We're delighted to be partnering with the Scott Arboretum, with whom Hardy Plant has a particularly close relationship. So we're very pleased to be here together. And we, of course, are delighted to welcome Tony Aiello as our speaker today. In addition to this important collaboration with Scott, we are also partnering with other public gardens and organizations in the Delaware Valley. From the Perennial Plant Conference, which we jointly sponsor with the Scott, the Pennsylvania Hort Society, Chanticleer, and Longwood, to joint lectures with Scott, Haverford, the Henry Foundation, Jenkins, we embrace our community of gardens and gardening. On December 5th, we will have our annual meeting, a hybrid meeting at Jenkins Arboretum with the speaker, Janet Novak, on wildflowers in the Mid-Atlantic region. She is a member of the Hardy Plant Society Mid-Atlantic Group, as well as 11 other plant-related societies, ranging from the Rock Garden Society, the Del Val chapter, to the Rhododendron Society. But we also organize an enormous variety of pop-up events, which include tours of public and private gardens throughout the region. And this year we had pop-up visits to many of our grant recipients as well. And we've organized a great many already for 2022, so keep checking the calendar. The work has been done to enhance, educate, and beautify the region. And it's very satisfying to visit our grant recipients and see what our grants are doing to beautify the community. Speaking of grants, Every year, we award grants throughout the region. And last year, we really were far flung. We were giving grants out of state and as far away as Pittsburgh. So if you know of schools, parks, arboretums, public gardens, as well as municipalities and many, many more throughout the region, the grant application process starts December 1st. And tell them about the program and encourage them to apply. And for those who love to continue to learn and have enjoyed our winter webinar series, Tuesdays at 10, keep your eyes on our website, hardyplant.org, to see what will be coming in January. We've already established a wonderful array for the year from January through March. And in addition to that, we have a seed exchange. Our March into Spring Symposium will be in March, and our hugely popular members-only garden tour will happen at the end of June. We have tours, both domestic and international, planned for 2022 as well. So if you're not a member, we encourage you to join in the fun. So just go to our website to join and also to see what activities we have planned. And finally, I'm done. I would like to hand this gavel over to Scott and to Tony Aiello.
Thanks so much, Nora. I really appreciate it. That's wonderful to hear that you have trips planned. The Scott Arboretum is not at that point yet, so that's great news. But thanks again to you and the Hardy Plant Society Mid-Atlantic chapter, and welcome everyone. I'm guessing from across the country. We often, when it's Hardy Plant Society, have some people joining in from the West Coast. So if you are, welcome to our webinar today. I'm Julie Jenny, Educational Programs Coordinator for the Scott Arboretum of Swarthmore College. The campus and extensive gardens of the Scott Arboretum are located in Swarthmore, Pennsylvania, and are open for visitors to explore. The scene behind me, the virtual scene, is our Scott Outdoor Amphitheater. It looks about like this right now. So if you're nearby, definitely come and see it. And also visit our website because we've got lots of programs going on, and our website is scottarboretum.org to see what we're offering. And check it often because our programs often, it's not that they change, but we keep adding them. We also have a couple of virtual webinar series, one that's called Gardens and Tonic, that's at 4 o'clock on Thursdays. So the next one is this Thursday, November 11th at 4 p.m., where we're going to journey through the studio gardens of award-winning designer Donald Pell as he focuses an unbiased eye, as he calls it, on what is and is not working in the novel plant communities he creates. So I'll be putting the link to that series on the website. And then the other thing to look forward to is Travels at 12 in a Green World, which is a webinar series that starts in January. All of our webinars are free, but you do need to register for them on our website, which again is scottarboretum.org. We don't have the Travels at 12 schedule up yet, but we hopefully will within the month or so. So just a few housekeeping notes for today. Please feel free to give Tony lots of good questions. You can put those into the chat box or the Q&A, and I'll keep track of them and I will read them to Tony at the end of the program. And I usually leave about 10 minutes for questions at the end. And then last but not least, this lecture today is being recorded, and I will be sending the recording link to the Hardy Plant Society to share with their members. You can also email me for the recording, but I thank you for doing so by this Tuesday of this coming week, and then I'll send the recording out on Wednesday. All you have to do is just send me an email in the subject line, put recording for November 7th, and I'll add you to the list to receive the recording. I won't respond to your email. I found that that's the majority of the emails that I get every week are to ask for recording. So I just keep track of them and then I send them out. So it is my great pleasure to introduce Tony Aiello today. I wish we were sitting in an auditorium on campus to introduce Tony in person to you, but thank you to him for being willing to do this through a webinar. But Tony Aiello is the Associate Director of Research, Conservation, and Plant Breeding at Longwood Gardens, where he participates in plant exploration, plant conservation, and curation. For the previous 20 plus years, he served as the Gail E. Maloney Director of Horticulture and Curator at the Morris Arboretum of the University of Pennsylvania, where he managed their historic gardens and living collections. These positions allow him to travel throughout the US, Europe, Japan, and China to find novel plants suitable for growing in the Delaware Valley. Tony has a Bachelor's of Science from Cornell University and a Master's of Science from Purdue University, and for many years chaired the North America China Plant Exploration Consortium. A native of Philadelphia and long-suffering Philly sports fan, Tony has written extensively about his travels, a variety of trees and shrubs, and the history of horticulture. Tony, many thanks again for agreeing to be our speaker for today. Again, I wish you were here in person, but this is going to be a great virtual presentation today, so I will now hand it over to you to share your screen and start your presentation.
Great. Okay, thanks, Julie, and thanks, Nora. Let's see if we can get this to work. And there we go. Okay, great. Well, I would say it's nice to see everybody, but it's nice to have everybody here today and have a chance to talk to you a little bit about, some of the things that I've done, but more importantly, about things that a lot of my colleagues from around the world have done. So what I want to do is talk a little bit about how botanic gardens are involved with tree conservation in particular. Both focusing mostly on the United States, a little bit internationally, and then also bringing it sort of home as much as possible in terms of how this impacts our lives as gardeners, and then also talk a little bit about not only tree conservation of wild trees, but talk a little bit about cultivated plants and conservation of cultivated plants. So we'll just go ahead and get started with that. So one of the groups that really is leading the charge in terms of tree conservation around the world in all regions, from tropical to temperate and to even further north, is the Global Trees Campaign, which is a group that really is based on or supported by Botanic Gardens Conservation International and Fauna and Flora International. And so it's very timely. BGCI just put out a State of the World's Trees, and you can see here some of the statistics that they had in this report. And this report is online if you want to look at it in more detail. And so I don't want this to be a total gloom and doom talk today. And there is a lot of positive things that are going on, which I'd like to focus on. But as you can see in this slide, 30% of the world's tree species are at risk of extinction. And 440 of these have fewer than 50 individuals remaining. But I think the positive side of it is that almost 2/3 of tree species are found in at least one protected area globally, and lots of people are working together. More than 500 experts have worked together on trying to come up with the ideas behind this report. So when we look at trees, we're, especially at this time of year, we're really focused on what we see outside. But when you think about the number of tree species, the tropics really have the greatest diversity, and as you would probably know and imagine. But if you look down this chart, you'll see that some things are surprising. For instance, Colombia, the country of Colombia, has the highest number of magnolias in the world, and those are all, many of those are micro-endemics and very threatened. If you look at Venezuela and Bolivia, there are lots of hollies in that part of the world, which you tend not to think of. And then China, which is a huge place, about almost exactly the size of the United States, but with much greater plant diversity, has large diversity and lots of threats to groups like magnolia, camellia, and maples. So this just gives you sort of a broad overview. But we often think, oh, these are tropical species, and what does this mean to me? But there's a sorbus species, a white bean, that's found in North Wales, which is highly endangered. There's only 30 trees remaining of this species, and so this makes it very local. That often there are things happening on a very, very local basis that we often don't think about, and do have impacts, and where we can really help. So I'll try and circle back to some examples like that. So one of the things that is happening with BGCI and the other groups that are working on tree conservation is that they've formed a whole series of global conservation consortia. And you can see those groups, the ones that have formed, you can see those here on this slide. And so some of these are things that we really cannot grow very well here, like cycads or dipterocarps, but many of these are plant groups that are native to our part of the world, and if not, are things that we can grow, grow particularly well. And I'll go into a little more detail on some of these. So I apologize, this is my only text-heavy slide. I'm not going to read through all of these things, but I'll touch on a couple of highlights that some of the objectives of these global conservation consortia include things like gathering experts together who might not normally be working together, identifying species of greatest conservation concern, looking at in situ conservation. And in situ means preserving the native habitats where these trees grow, which is really the highest priority. And if that doesn't work, looking at ex situ collections, fostering research, building capacity, both in country and then elsewhere to help preserve some of these species and so on. And this distinction between in situ and ex situ is important. And in many cases, it's impossible or very difficult to preserve the native habitats. And so that's where botanic gardens really come in, is having ex situ, having collections that are outside of the native habitats that really serve as a backup for preservation of these tree species. And so the greatest story of ex situ conservation, or maybe not the greatest, but one of the most familiar, is Franklinia alatamaha, the Franklin tree, which is extinct in the wild, only known in botanic gardens. And this is a great example of something, if it wasn't grown in botanic gardens, it wouldn't exist anymore today. So all of the diversity is held in botanic gardens. And if you have a Franklinia in your home garden, then you're preserving a small portion of that genetic diversity. And so this is I think this is one that I think works really well for homeowners and gardeners as an example of something that you can do at home. And if you can grow Franklinia, you can help preserve a little bit of this species. So one of the things that the BGCI, Botanic Gardens Conservation International, does is come out with red lists of various plant groups. And red lists are lists of species that indicate the levels of threat that these various species have. So these are long lists of species with lots of detail about which ones are threatened, population sizes, things like that. And all of these are online. They're really interesting insights into what's going on into the world of conservation. And I'll dig down a little bit on oaks and maples, because those are plant groups that are, I think, most familiar to us. Not that magnolias are not, but and that have some real relevance to botanic gardens in our area, and even to what we can do in our own gardens. So just so we're on the same page, when you talk about when BGCI or IUCN, other groups concerned with plant and animal conservation, when they talk about levels of threat, this is what they talk about. And so you go from, if you look at all species, then you look at ones that are evaluated. There are some that really are of least concern, some that approach near threatened. And as you go up this chart, you have increasing extinction risk. And the threatened categories are really these in the center here: vulnerable, endangered, and critically endangered, before you get to extinct in the wild and extinct. And all of these terms are defined both in those red lists that I showed, and then also on various, the IUCN and the BGCI websites. So just as an example, we look at Magnoliaceae, the Magnolia family. And if you look at, this is a chart that shows the how frequent or how common these plants are in botanic gardens. And things like Liriodendron, very common, or common tulip tree, or Southern Magnolia, is found in 255, 225 collections. And these are of least concern. And usually there's an inverse proportion between how rare a plant is and how much it's found in the botanic garden, which seems obvious, right? If it's a very rare plant in the wild, it's going to be rare in botanic gardens. But occasionally, and what's interesting is occasionally there's an exception to this. And here's Magnolia stellata, the star magnolia, very, very common garden plant, held in, when this survey was done, in over 200 botanic garden collections. And this is an endangered species in the wild. And this is where it becomes very interesting to me, where you have very common garden plants and you have plants that have some level of conservation concern, whether they're endangered or threatened or vulnerable. And this is where, plants that have been grown in botanic gardens or in private gardens really can contribute to the total genetic makeup of trying to conserve a species. So sort of the ex situ populations are much broader in cases like this. And so these are very interesting cases to me. So in the case of Magnolia stellata, there's actually habitat fragmentation and habitat destruction. There are only a few scattered populations in Japan left. And when you get that, you tend to have less genetic diversity. And there's some work going on currently to examine to compare the amount of genetic diversity of the plants in the wild to that of cultivated plants, and to basically see if what's in cultivation captures the diversity of what's in the wild, or whether further conservation measures need to be taken. And we'll talk about this in a little bit. We'll come back to this idea of essentially how much diversity do you capture in cultivated plants, and how does that compare to what's in the wild? Essentially, how many pandas do you need in captivity? And in this case, pandas are star magnolias. How many pandas do you need to preserve the genetic diversity of that species? Okay, so when you think about this, next time you see a star magnolia in your garden or in your neighborhood, this is something that is, as I said, very common, but it has threats to its survival in the wild. And so this plant that's in your neighborhood may in some way help contribute to preserving the overall genetic composition of the species. So switching a little bit to looking at oaks, there has been a very active group based at the Morton Arboretum in Chicago, the Global Conservation Consortium for Oak. One of the things that they've produced in the last few years is a red list of US oaks. So looking at all oak species in the United States and examining the level of threat or conservation concern of these species. So one of the things that happens is once you have sort of an overall view, a big picture view, then the various organizations do what's known as a gap analysis, where they really drill down and look at what the diversity of these various species is in botanic gardens, in cultivation. So we'll dive into this a little bit. This chart on the right, essentially, and I'll blow this up in a minute. This chart on the right shows essentially the number of plants in cultivation for all of these various species, North American or US species, not just North American, US species, okay? And so if we look a little closer, this is a chart which is based on number of plants in the thousands. And if you look at things like Quercus ruba or Quercus alba, this is the number of ex situ collections at botanic gardens in the world that were surveyed for these species. So thousands of plants, white oak and red oak and other common oaks. And you see the ones with stars are species of conservation concern. So two of these these, as I said, when you have very common plants, you tend to have things that are not very rare. If you bring the scale down a little bit, this scale is in the hundreds of plants in ex situ collections. You start to see that there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 threatened species held with some degree of numbers at botanic gardens. But what gets very interesting is when you look at the rarest oak species in the United States, and if you look down at this right-hand end, all of these very rare species are held, the numbers held in ex situ collections are are less than 20, less than 2 dozen. And so again, this just points out that the rarer the plant is in the wild, the rarer it is going to be in cultivation in ex situ collections. And so the greater concern is for the conservation of these species and the greater need to protect them, whether it's in their native habitat or to protect them in botanic garden collections. Okay, so I just want to give a couple examples of when we're talking about oaks, about how this happens and how this works. So, forgive me if I digress a little bit here. Not last month, in September, my colleague Peter Zale and I went to southern Alabama and southern Georgia to do some plant collecting. We were looking at not only, we were looking at 2 oak species, but also some native azaleas as well. One, to add these to our collections at Longwood Gardens, but also to do some work in trying to serve as a conduit essentially to grow these on and to share these with other folks in terms of trying to preserve them. Okay, so we did a quick loop. We landed in, it was a very quick trip, just a few days. It was the first time I'd been on an airplane in 2 years, so that was interesting. So we flew down to Birmingham, did a quick loop, stopped in a place called Solon-Dixon Forestry Center, which is part of Auburn University, went over to a private garden near Albany, Georgia, up to F.D. Roosevelt State Park at Pine Mountain, and then up to Oak Mountain State Park near Birmingham. At the beginning of our trip, we we scheduled our time with another group that was doing some collecting, some folks from the Poly Hill Arboretum, and then some local botanists as well. So it was a pretty remarkable moment to really be in the field with so many incredibly knowledgeable people, and really a lot of fun to be out there with all these folks. And so one of the places we visited was a private garden in Lee County near Albany, a small city in southwest Georgia. This is a property of a woman named Monica Williams purchased a few years ago. Not knowing much about horticulture or native azaleas, and turns out that she has 4 taxa of native azaleas there on her property, including the northeasternmost occurrence of Rhododendron ostrinum. And so if you want to learn more about her property and there's a really good article in the Azalean, which is the journal of the North American Azalea Society. So we made a few collections of native azaleas, which is not exactly part of this talk, but I thought it'd be interesting to show some nice nice images as we're getting into winter of some of our native azaleas. So one was Rhododendron alabamense, this was a very interesting location for it because it's rare outside of Alabama. It flowers, as many of you probably know, in April and May, fragrant, and it does very, very well. It's very heat tolerant. It does really well for us in our part of the world. This is Monica Williams with a plant that the first plant she really discovered on her property, a plant that she calls the Queen. This enormous Rhododendron alabamense, much larger than many people have seen, and really a pretty remarkable plant. We also collected Rhododendron ostrinum, and so this is a plant that is listed worldwide as a vulnerable species. It's imperiled in its native habitat, largely through habitat destruction and logging. Again, another excellent species for our area, heat resistance and mildew resistance, and a great plant, not just as a garden plant, but also to help, again, with conservation efforts. Rhododendron canescens, a much more widespread and variable species. Again, you can see from this chart that has a pretty wide range, and we again made some collections of this. And then because of these various species there were these hybrid swarms with these remarkable flower colors, and so these were all seed collections that we were making of these various rhododendrons. And finally, Rhododendron viscosum. Again, pretty common plant, but something that because it's stoloniferous and tolerates wet soils, and so a plant that may have or probably has greater garden adaptability than perhaps some of the other ones. So again, sort of a combination of plants with conservation importance and plants with horticultural importance as well. So getting back to Quarkus, one of the things that was a great surprise to me as we were traveling around Alabama is that there are 39 species of oak in Alabama. And to put that in perspective, there are 90 species in North America. So that's, almost 50% of North American oak species are found in Alabama. In Pennsylvania, we have maybe 15 or so species, somewhere around that range. So it's incredible, enormous diversity of oak. And there's a lot of efforts with folks in Alabama to preserve these plants and really preserve some of the diversity. So we were fortunate to meet some folks at Oak Mountain State Park outside of Birmingham who were able to facilitate us making a collection of Corpus Bointonii. This is a plant that is critically endangered. You can see on this upper figure, there are scattered populations of it, and it occurs only in Alabama. It grows on mountain balds, and so one of the and probably grows in fire habitats. So changes in habitat and in forest management have really restricted the range of Boynton's oak. So here's the site that we visited at Oak Mountain. Pretty remarkable place. These are very old Pinus palustris. These plants that you see scattered around. And Lauren Muncher, who's the park naturalist, helped us out there. Some of these Pinus, the yellow pines, could be up to 200, 250 years old. And what's fascinating about them is they would fall over and still have some roots in the ground, and they would continue. Then they would start to send shoots up. Here's Corpus Bointonii. It's kind of a shrubby plant, and plants like this, or the one that Lauren is next to, again, can also be up to 200 or 250 years old. So extremely harsh conditions and slow growing plants, a fire regime, and plants that really need human intervention to keep these habitats as they are. Just a close up of Boynton's oak, beautiful foliage, and as you can see on the left, kind of a scrubby, shrubby plant, not what we often think of as oaks. So also on that trip, we visited Pine Mountain, FD Roosevelt State Park, or Pine Mountain. This is near Warm Springs, where FDR would go to sort of recuperate and spend a lot of time there. Is actually where near where he died. And so Quercus georgiana, abundant at a few localities. It's threatened, so maybe not quite as high a risk as Quercus Bointonii, but still a plant that has some great threats to it. So at this escarpment here, you can see at Pine Mountain, we were able to make a good collection of that. So the goal with these is not only to grow them on at Longwood, but also to share them with other folks to help have backup collections should something happen to these wild populations. Okay, so I want to bring it a little bit closer to home. And Corpus Falcata, which is sometimes called the Spanish oak or the southern red oak, is a plant with a very, very wide distribution. But as you can see, in Pennsylvania, there are a couple county records of it occurring in southeastern Pennsylvania. Some of these are historic records, and some of these are records, or some of these are historic records, and some of these populations no longer exist due to development. So Corpus Falcata is a beautiful plant. It's in the red oak group. It seems to have much greater resistance to some of the leaf scorch issues that red oak and other red oaks get, and has good fall color. It seems to have good heat tolerance as well. So it's a plant that, at least at Longwood, we're looking at as a potential replacement for Quercus rubra or red oak. But because of its, even though it has this wide distribution in the United States, in Pennsylvania, it's listed as being endangered, again, mostly through habitat loss. Much of its populations were probably in areas that are now farmed in Chester County or even Delaware County. And so, sometimes plant collecting is very prosaic. Here we are in East Nottingham Township in Chester County, far southern Chester County, near the Maryland border. And Quercus Falcata is just growing along roadsides. Here Peter is making a collection. Here it's along another roadside in Nottingham Township. And so, these plants have a very narrow band. If you know where the Hers potato chip factory is, we were collecting right near there. And very narrow band on the serpentine soil types, and so very restricted populations of Quarkus Falcata. A very similar story is Willow Oak or Quercus fellow. So you can see this map is very similar. There are, historic records of it in southeast Pennsylvania along the Delaware. Much of its habitat is now the city of Philadelphia, Philadelphia Airport, I-95, places like that are where Willow Oak would occur naturally in Pennsylvania. So much of it's also listed as endangered in Pennsylvania, even though, again, it has a huge distribution south of us. And so Willow Oak is a wonderful street tree, very disease resistant, heat tolerance, and is a great urban tree. Often much of what we grow as commercially is of more southern provenances. So it's important to get provenances or seed sources that are local. So last fall during the pandemic, fall of 2020, we were restricted in our travel. And so we did some local collecting, and that's when we did the Quercus Falcata. Here we are at, this is actually at Andalusia, the garden in Bucks County along the Delaware River. Kind of on the edge of Andalusia, there's some wooded areas and there are willow oaks growing along the edge of these, or in these woods. Here we are digging up some seedlings. And nearby, in another location, a small wooded area that's mostly used for motorbike riding are some other large willow oaks. So we were able to make some collections, local collections at some of the remaining populations. This is around the Neshaminy Creek, if you know where Delhas Woods is, or Neshaminy Creek State Park. Those are the areas where some of the remaining populations of willow oak in Pennsylvania occur. Okay, so I want to move into another group that I've worked with a lot over, through my career, looking at maples. Excuse me. And so, as there is with the oaks and magnolias, there's a global conservation consortium for Acer, or for maple. The Red List of Maples, a revised version, came out last year in 2020. And I just wanted to point out this one graphic that they had. If you look at the upper part of this, it shows the species diversity per country. And really China, Japan, and Southeast Asia are the places in the world with the greatest species diversity. And then if you look at the lower graphic, which has the percentage of threatened species. One thing to point out is that there are no threatened maples in the United States or Canada, which is good news for us. Most of the threatened species are in China and again in Southeast Asia. So where the greatest diversity is where you have the greatest number of threats. So I want to highlight a couple plants that I've worked with over the years that are included in the red list. One is a species that you've probably never heard of, Acer Grisia. It's endangered. It has very fragmented distribution in central China, and it's really threatened by habitat degradation and loss. So the triangles represent herbarium records and sort of historic herbarium records. So it's not really clear if these are still, if these populations are still there or not. And so that right-hand graphic really just represents everything that's recorded in herbaria. And what really needs to happen is to have these field checked to see if these populations are viable and if these plants are still there. Back in 2005, I visited, along with some colleagues, visited one of these populations and made a small seed collection. And this represents the only seed collection known in cultivation, both in China and in the West. And so if we're looking at ex situ conservation of this species, there's a very narrow sampling that's been done. And so here we are at this site. You can see there's in the background, there's actually a parking lot. This is a site of a famous battle in the Chinese Civil War in 1949. There's a victory of the communists over the nationalists at this location. So there's a big monument there. And this was, as I said, 2005. And there was the beginnings of a sort of hotel, motel, kind of a ecotourism site there. And So right next to where we were, and you can see there's this telephone poles right next to this tree. So it really begs the question of what has happened to this population. And there were only a few scattered trees at this site. And so we really wonder, or I really wonder, whether these trees are still there, or what the status is of this. So this really represents a plant that we don't know much about. What we do know makes us think that it's a very vulnerable species, and so this is a case where further work needs to be done. It's related to trident maple, or Acer Grisia, if you know that species, which is again a much more common garden plant. So stay tuned about this one. I hope to get back at some point when we can travel to Asia and really do a little more investigation about the status of it. Something that's much more familiar, but to me was surprising when I learned that it's endangered in China, is Acer Grisia. So paper bark maple, a plant that I think we all know and hopefully love, is native to central China. But again, because of habitat fragmentation, it's endangered, and there are approximately 12 to 15 populations remaining, many of which are very isolated from each other, and many of which are only represented by a few trees. And you'll have to forgive me, I'll talk for a little bit about Acer Grisia and a project I've been working on for going on, approaching 10 years now with it. So at this time of year, paper bark maple is starting to show its fall color, which is really fabulous. If you go out to the West Coast, you see them all over the place as street trees, and you're beginning to see them, more commonly here as street trees as well. And then here, this is the Chicago Art Institute used in an installation there. So up until a few years ago, really everything in cultivation came from 3 collections, and really these dots, would be on top of each other in terms of the scale. So 3 collections from a small portion of the range of Acer Grisia. One of the most recent collections was in 1994 when some seedlings were brought back to the US from China. And so the goal of this project, similar to what I mentioned with Magnolia stellata, the goal is to really determine whether or not the diversity of cultivated plants accurately reflects that of plants in the wild, or whether conservation efforts are needed, further conservation efforts are needed. And I think what we found is that there are further conservation efforts needed, and I'll talk a little bit about that as well. So we started out back around 2013-14, taking leaf samples from a number of trees to use for a genetic analysis, looking at trees that were of known origin, some of which were collected by E.H. Wilson in 1901 when he collected seed in central China. He then Wilson collected 2 or 3 plants in 1907, which all are at the Arnold Arboretum. As I said, the NACPEC 94 collection, there are plants at the Arnold, the Morris, and at the U.S. National Arboretum. And then we also did some sampling of cultivated plants as well. And then just to run through, there's a very old plant at the Morris Arboretum, kind of on the edge of the property. Not a huge plant, but based on documentation, a plant that was planted around 1912. Highland Park in Rochester, there's some beautiful old trees there, which again came from Veitch nurseries in the UK around in the mid-19 teens. The sort of mother of all paper bark maples at the Arnold Arboretum. This is one of Wilson's 1907 seedlings. And then to follow up on that, I visited the West Coast, where a lot of the commercial production of Acer Grisia is, and visited Heritage Seedlings, a tree nursery, visited a research station and Washington Park Arboretum, and then had a tree that Dan Hinckley had collected in 2008. So Heritage Seedlings is mostly a liner producer of trees, some shrubs, grows lots of very unusual, interesting plants. So they created a seed orchard about 20 years ago or so, and this seed orchard has evolved into this. On the left, you see about 2 acres seed orchard of paper bark maple, and here you can see their 2-year-old seedlings lined out in bread trays. So So if you have chances are, if you have Acer Grisium growing in your home that you've planted in the last 10 to 15 years, it came from this location. They've been growing tens of thousands of these plants over the last 20 years or so. So we also wanted to document the diversity of plants in the UK. So in 2014, Chris Bachtel and I, Chris from the Morton Arboretum, we traveled to the UK to visit some very old and some very old specimens throughout England, Wales, and Scotland. And I'll just highlight a couple of these. Here you can see all the places we visited, everything from Kew Gardens and Windsor Gardens, going down to the coast at a really interesting garden called High Down on the south coast, up to Wales, and then all the way up through the Cotswolds, up to, and then eventually up to Scotland. So sort of the mother lode of paper bark maple is a garden called Differin in Wales. It's now a National Trust garden, a really fabulous garden. And there are many, it seems that whoever was gardening there planted paper bark maples. So it seems that there are trees from maybe not every decade of the last 100 years, but at least every 20 years over the last 100 years, including the national champion there in the UK, which is this grand old tree, which was collected, is one of Wilson's 1901 collections. And so what we were doing was we were taking leaf samples, we're putting them in silica. So this is, the silica you buy at Michael's to produce dried flowers. And then once we do this, folks at the Morton Arboretum can do the DNA extractions, and I'll show you a little bit about that and make the comparisons of these plants. So again, visited Westonbirt, another stately old paper bark maple. And then in 2015, so before I go into that, so what we had done from 2013 to 2014 was to try and sample as many cultivated plants of known origin as we could. In 2015, we went to China. So we, meaning Chris Bachtel, Michael Dosman from the Arnold Arboretum, Kong Wang from Beijing Botanic Garden, and a former Scott Arboretum intern, and myself went to China to visit as many populations as we could in the wild, and to, again, take leaf samples so we could compare the cultivated material to the wild material. We traveled in about a 500-mile range of Xi'an, central China, a very mountainous region. So it may travel, very interesting. And, just to give you an idea of what 500 miles looks like on the US. So it'd be more like traveling around Salt Lake City, just because of the mountains and the sort of terrain that we were traveling through. Okay, so essentially I showed you the other map that had, former locations that collections were made, and we increased the sampling by visiting a large number of other locations. Just show this again graphically in a different way. These are the places that we visited. So I just want to point out two collections, one here in Chongqing, right on the border with Sichuan. This is where the plant was first noted by Western botanists, and then also another spot in southern Shanxi province that I'll show you. So in Chongqing, we stayed at this was our lodgings, it's sort of a bed and breakfast type hotel, and the great view up into the mountains. We were definitely a cause of commotion there. I don't think a lot of Westerners visit this part of China, and so the children were really, and adults as well, were really excited to see us there, helped us out with our seed collecting. And, one of the challenges of this trip is, even though paper bark maple is a pretty distinguished, easily distinguished plant, when you get to a site like this, so we had GPS coordinates that we knew roughly where these plants were, but we would get to a place like this and basically try and find someone who could help us find these plants. In this small village, we use Kong. You can see Kong there in the Kong Wang in the red hat, starts asking around if anyone knows this plant. And in this case, one of the local farmers, Mr. Shah, did know this plant, and he was probably in his 60s and far fitter than any of us. And he led us up this steep mountain, all the while chain smoking, while we were, huffing and puffing it up the mountain to essentially we crawled up this mountainside to these this wild population of paper bark maple. Many of these had been coppiced over the years. You can see this one on the right had been cut and resprouted. So it was probably about 18 inches across at the base with all of these resprouts growing from it. So it's not what, our picture of this plant is when it's open grown and, sort of babied and looking very full and, and round with a rounded crown. Here's one that Michael's holding on to. And it really was, a treacherous place to be. But here's Mr. Shaw hanging on to this paper bark, and here's another one. So we were able to do some pretty wide sampling there. I'll mention this population is important, and we'll get back to it in a minute or two. Another site we visited was in southern Shanxi province, where we're staying in the city of Hong Kong. So it's always fascinating because we're going from these incredibly rural places to highly urbanized places, and then seeing the transition from urbanization as kind of suburbanization spreads out, and then getting back into these rural areas. So this was a tree that we knew about from a 1995 trip that Rick Lewandowski and Ned Garvey from National Arboretum had taken, and they had documented the location of this tree. So we had the GPS coordinates, and we were able to locate this plant. And so this is, as far as any of us know, the world's biggest paper bark maple. We were all amazed at it, and amazed to be there, seeing this tree in the flesh, as it were. Again, taking samples of it for the genetic work that was to come. Okay, and then just briefly, this is what our evenings would look like as we sorted and kept track of all these things. And I'll just back up for 1 second. You can see here, there's a herbarium press, and whenever we're doing field work like this, or in the United States, we're not only taking living specimens, whether it's seed or leaf tissue, but we're taking herbarium specimens that can be preserved and put in herbaria and preserved for perpetuity, basically, and really document what we've done. So, okay, so I said the molecular work was done at the Morton Arboretum. I don't expect you to read this, but basically what this shows, these are all the collections we made, whether it's in Europe, northern China, Hubei, central China, or southern China. And basically the uppermost rectangle is everything in cultivation, and essentially everything that we sampled in cultivation, whether it's in the northeastern United States, western United States, any cultivated plants, all derive, and all the stuff in Europe, all derive from E.H. Wilson's 1901 seed collection. So this is a real example of a genetic bottleneck. We've since then we've identified that population that where we climbed, that I showed you, where we climbed up the mountain in that village, and one other population that are not preserved. All the other places we visited are nature preserves of some sort or another. We had Cyanwood shipped to Beltsville, to the Plant Germplasm Quarantine Center there. Here's Chris Bachtel grafting these. This is in March of 2019. Chris did the grafting there. So basically we're creating a backup of these two populations in China that have some threat from, whether it's forestation or deforestation or agriculture. Some of these scions went to the Beijing Botanic Garden, where they will be grown there, and the others are in Beltsville and hopefully will be released and then grown at U.S. Botanic Gardens, distributed to Botanic Gardens. So here we are. So the grafting was done in March of 19. Here we are in June of 19, looking at the grafted plants. And so these are still in quarantine. Hopefully they'll be released before too long. And then the next phase of this project, I'm hoping to do this winter, is to go to the UK. There's an estate called Goodwood House in Southern England that's interested in developing conservation collections. So we're going to do a similar grafting project, backing up many of the significant trees throughout the UK and then grow them in the forestry areas of Goodwood House. So stay tuned for that. Okay, so I just want to touch on a few things in Japan that I've worked on. So looking at in 2018 and 19, I traveled to Japan, and you can see all the locations here. I want to highlight a location in far southwest Honshu, where we visited a forestry research station in Wakayama Prefecture. Beautiful place. Still temperate, but it's an area that gets among the highest rainfall in all of Japan. So lots of broadleaf evergreens. This is the team from 2018 with Miniaki Azawa from Utsunomiya University and his student Shibano. Todd Ronseville from what was then he was then at Poly Hill, now it's at the U.S. National Arboretum. Steve Schneider and Michael Dosman from the Arnold Arboretum. Again, this is just touch on a cultivated plant that is fairly common in cultivation, but has some real threats. So this is Ceodopatis verticillata, or the umbrella pine. And so it's a plant that, because of logging and habitat destruction, is severely restricted in the wild. And so again, it was important to try and get some ex situ collections of this. So both in 18 and 19, we visited this location that was very inaccessible. And you can see some young Ceodopatis seedlings, umbrella pine seedlings, growing here. Here's Steve with a mature tree. And one of the things we didn't realize in 2018 is that the cones take 2 years to mature. So we collected cones in 18 and didn't get anything. Went back in 19 and realized, okay, that's the problem. These are 2-year-old cones, and these have viable seed in them. So those plants are growing at our various institutions, and hopefully we'll introduce some new genetics into the United States and help with some conservation work. One of the other plants that we were interested in is, again, a fairly common garden plant, the Japanese Stewardia, or Stewardia pseudocamellia. It's actually a plant that there are few, if any, wild collections in the United States. So again, a genetic bottleneck. It's not really threatened in Japan, but in terms of increasing the diversity of what's in the US, we were interested in collecting this. So this is in 2019, made some really good collections of it, and look forward to having these growing in our various institutions. So, okay, I want to really switch gears here, and I should wrap up in about, I don't know, no more than 10 minutes, Julie. So I hope we're okay with time, and talk a little bit about cultivated collections. And so, this whole concept of serendipitous collections and unanticipated needs. And so, one of the roles of arboreta and botanic gardens are to grow plants and to grow diversity of plants. And part of the thinking behind that is you never know what you might need. And so it's a library, really, and you never know who's going to need that plant and not that book, but that's the best equivalent. So you're probably familiar with the European hazelnut or European filbert, the red-leafed form, and up until about 20 years ago, these were relatively common in parks and bigger properties. But as you can see in this slide, these trees started to decline really rapidly, I'd say about 20 years ago. And this was due, and it also happens with Harry Lauder's walking stick. This is due to a native North American fungus called Eastern filbert blight. You can see these little lesions on the stem are the blight, and it tends to kill European hazelnuts. There happened to be a very old tree. This is probably about 120-year-old tree at the Morris Arboretum. There were, in this area, there had been red leaf forms that slowly died off. This was one tree that survived. It seems to be completely resistant or tolerant, at least, of Eastern filbert blight. And this is a great example of growing on plants, having collections, then you never know what you might have. This plant, while I was at the marsh, I shared with the USDA germplasm repository in Corvallis. And so this is now being preserved for its disease resistance. Okay, and then I want to wrap up by talking about one of my favorite plant groups, flowering cherries. And so I think, I could talk for a long time about this, but I think everybody knows, hopefully knows the story of the importation of these in the early 1900s. And they've really become part of our lives as well as part of, lives of people around the world. And much of what we think of when we think about flowering cherries in the spring are Yoshino cherries, which are, incredibly floriferous. But there's, remarkable diversity of flowering cherries. There are hundreds of types of them. Many of these were for sale in the U.S. in the early 1900s up through the 19 teens from places like the Yokohama Nursery Company. And so there was this infusion of diversity into the United States starting around 1910 or so up through World War I, maybe a little later than up to World War II, from Japan, and then things really sort of stopped. And so compared to the cultivated diversity that you would have seen in parks and gardens 100 years ago, what we have today is, don't get me wrong, I love, it's one of my favorite plant groups. I love flowering cherries, but it really, there's a lot of restriction in what we have in terms of diversity. And so one of the things that I've been working on along with colleagues from the U.S. National Arboretum and elsewhere is trying to preserve some of these cultivars and redistribute some of these cultivars that are in only in botanic gardens. So there was a nursery called the Gardens Nurseries in Narberth, PA. A man named A.E. Wohlert was the nurseryman there. Really fabulous nurseryman. Sold lots of mostly flowering trees. If this image looks similar to the ones I showed from Yokohama, it is, because he borrowed it from the Yokohama catalog, and in some cases put his names on Japanese old Japanese cultivars, but we won't get into that. And a big collection of his plants went to the Scott Arboretum. This is an old image of Scott Arboretum from the 1940s. This was actually taken, Julie, on the day that the amphitheater was dedicated. And one of these trees is still there today. One of these around the corner is still there today. Much of this collection, so this collection originally was planted at the Scott in the 1930s. Many of them came from Wohlert. By the 80s, they were declining. They were repropagated and replanted, and this is what you see today. These trees are sort of starting to age out as well, and so I know folks at the Scott Arboretum are working to repropagate and back up this collection. And so there are things there, and this is an example at the Scott Arboretum, but the same is true elsewhere. There are plants there that are only there. There's a beautiful cultivar, a flowering cherry called Minoga. As far as I know, this is the only tree that I could find in the Northeast United States, or in the US, period. And so for years, I was propagating this and redistributing it so that it would be backed up at other gardens. It's a really fabulous thing. It's a little, flowers at the same time as Kanzan, but it's a little more tempered, if you would, than Kanzan. So just to back up this idea of this sort of loss of diversity, this was a planting at the Morris Arboretum in 1959. If you know Cherry Row at the Morris, the Metasequoia Grove is would be over here on the right. This is it as it's being planted in 1959. These plants all came from a nursery, Henry Holman's nursery in Kingsville, Maryland. And if you look at his catalogs, not only flowering cherries, but an incredible diversity of plants were for sale. Here's the row about 25 years later, and here it is, a a couple of years ago. So one of the things that I was working on and I continue to work on is backing up and trying to preserve these old cherries. As I said, every generation or so this happens. There were folks, this is Roland Jefferson on the left and Donald Egoff on the right at the National Arboretum. They were doing the same thing in the 1980s with the National Arboretum's collection. So some of those are seen here at the Morris Arboretum. Some are elsewhere at other gardens. So again, it's something that needs to be something that needs to be done generationally to preserve these plants. And the beauty of plants is you can propagate them. But the other thing is that they do have lifespans. And so Prunus gyoko, one of the most exquisite flowering cherries, is shown here. Again, when I was started to do this work, there was one tree at the Morris and one tree at the National Arboretum. Those were the only two remaining in the US. And so we both started propagating these and distributing these. And then finally, Higurashi, another beautiful late flowering form is one at Longwood Gardens, something else that we've been propagating and distributing. So I think, I just have a couple more slides. I know I'm running a little late, but one of the things that I've been working on with the National Arboretum for about 10 years now is trying to get some new cultivated forms of flowering cherries into the US. And this is Chris Lane, who has written books on witch hazels and wisteria, among other things, incredible nurseryman from Southern England. Chris has an incredible collection of flowering cherries, as well as many other things. Working through the quarantine station in Beltsville, I've been importing cherries along with a colleague at the National Arboretum. These are all things that are not in the United States, and so I'll just go through these quickly and show you some of these, and hopefully these have been in quarantine. Some now have been in quarantine since 2013, so going on 9 years. And hopefully before I retire, I will see these released from quarantine, but all beautiful and all will make great additions to our horticulture. Okay, so I know I've maybe gone a little over, but be happy to answer any questions that I might have.
Actually, Tony, that was perfect because Nora and I took up the first 10 minutes. So you're right on time. You're good to go.
Good.
But thank you. And that was fascinating seeing that picture. I don't know if maybe I've seen it once before. I think that was Beardsley Hall, the one from like 1942, 43. Yep. That's very cool.
Yeah, and those were taken by Edgar Wary was going to the dedication of the amphitheater, and I'm assuming he was there early and took some photos. So
that's very neat. Yeah. So thank you for this. Lots more I want to say, but you do have some good questions here, so I will dive right into those. Let's see. The first one that came in: when you are collecting, is it only seeds, acorns, or live branches?
Yeah. So generally, when we go collecting, whether it's in the U.S. or whether it's in internationally, we collect seed. And so when we're doing it internationally, we collect seed for two reasons. One is, for a few reasons. One is that essentially seed has evolved for transportation, right? For dispersal. So it's much easier to transport seed and import seed than it is plants. And they're a lot less perishable. So if you think about, if you collect 100 acorns, you could have 100 oaks at some point. If you try to collect 100, and as much as, 100 acorns is basically a Ziploc bag of acorns. If you try and collect 100 oak seedlings, you have to keep them alive. It's very hard to import something like that. So even in the US, we tend to collect seed, one, because it's not as perishable, and two, because you can capture a greater diversity than you can with plants.
Okay. Next question. Do you ever see common problems with willow oaks with iron chlorosis? Sorry, a little tongue tied there.
Yes, although maybe less than with things like pin oak or scarlet oak. But yeah, you can, although it's adapted to sort of to heavier, so areas with heavier soil. So it tends to be more tolerant of poor soils. But yes, in higher pH areas, you can see some issues with that. But it's a pretty tough plant. And so I'd say it's better than some of the other members of the red oak group.
Yeah, we've got some great willow oaks here on campus that I always enjoy seeing. Can you explain a genetic bottleneck?
Oh, sure. Okay, so a genetic bottleneck is what it sounds like. So when you have a species with a wide amount of genetic diversity, and what's brought into cultivation is only a narrow fragment of that diversity. So paper bark maple is a good example. So of all the ones grown in the United States, or in the world, it looks like most of what is grown is from that 1901 Wilson collection. So that's the bottleneck, is there's only a little bit that's been brought into cultivation. The most famous genetic bottleneck is the mutiny on the Bounty, because they were bringing breadfruit. Captain Bligh was bringing breadfruit because the breadfruit that had been grown around the world was from a very small sample and was being killed by diseases. And so the Bounty was bringing breadfruit to be cultivated in tropical places. And the reason Captain Bligh got in trouble is that the fresh water was going to the breadfruit and not to the crew. So that's what the mutiny was about.
Okay. Let's see. Do you have any experienced thoughts on Dawn redwoods?
Yeah, so it's a broad question. And that's actually, it's interesting because Dawn redwood there are very small populations in China. It was collected in the 40s. And then there was a whole other series of collections made in the early 90s to increase the genetic diversity. And so I suspect that what's in cultivation really, and I suspect people have done this work, I just haven't looked at it lately, that what's in cultivation really does represent pretty well what still exists of Dawn redwood in the wild. And there's not much of it left in China. And so particularly with that 1990 collection, because I think the original collection was from only a couple of trees. And then there was a professor named John Kuser at Rutgers University who really wanted to expand the diversity in cultivation when he brought this in the 90s. And so that's in many botanic gardens now. So I think that there is probably pretty good representation, if that's what the question is.
Not a bottleneck with the Dawn redwood.
Probably less so, but it'd be interesting to know for sure. And I suspect people have done that work because it's probably the most written about woody plant of anything that I've ever seen.
Yeah, I would agree. Here's a good question. Why is the quarantine so long?
Oh, okay. So with some things it's not as long as with others. And so with the paper bark maple, we were told 2 years. And essentially what they are doing at the quarantine station is testing them for diseases and making sure they're not diseased before they release them. So with flowering cherries, though, they come as signwood, so they come as little sticks, and so they have lots and lots of. In the case of flowering cherries, they have lots of disease. They had lots of diseases, and the USDA folks are very concerned because there are so many prunus of commercial value, cherries, plums, nectarines, et cetera, of letting diseases out, and so. What they do there is the original plants, they actually do the grafting. This is your tax dollars at work in a good way. They do the grafting, they grow them on, they test them for diseases. They then put them into tissue culture so they can clean them up, grow them on again, and test them again. And so because of the length of the process and because of the number of potential problems that were on them, the flowering cherries have taken a really long time. And I'm not kidding that I hope to see these before I retire. So we started in 2013. They're all still there being taken care of, and then hopefully they'll get out at some point.
So I'm wondering, Tony, is there anything that people watching today, homeowners, can do to help this effort? I think your analogy of the panda is an interesting one, because when you put a panda up on the TV screen, you know, it's like a cute, cuddly animal that you can't imagine not having on this earth. But with, you know, to those of us watching, to not have any more Acer Grisiums would just be a horrible thing. And so is there anything besides, you know, growing them? Are there organizations people can give to help continue this effort?
Sure. I think, yeah, I think you can support, you know, any of your local botanic gardens that they're doing anything like this. And then, you know, Botanic Gardens, BGCI, Botanic Gardens Conservation International, is a great organization. The Global Trees Campaign, both are really great organizations that are really doing good work on tree conservation. And so I would recommend people go to the Global Trees Campaign website. And there's some really compelling case studies there, and many of them are tropical. And so you think, oh, this really doesn't relate to me, but there are others that are closer to home. And so let me see if I can type that in. So it's if you just search for Global Trees, not Trust, Trees Campaign, you'll get to there. And yeah, so you know, if you are interested and able, then supporting those organizations would be fabulous, because they're doing really great work.
Okay, good.
And then don't collect, you know, unless you have permits, don't collect these things, or you know, stay above board when you're collecting, you know, doing any kind of wild collecting.
Well, I know here at the Scott Arboretum, we're really trying to establish our heritage tree program, where we're looking at trees that might be thought of as rare or endangered, or if there aren't many of them, and really make sure that the college understands how important they are, and not to take them down for the next construction project.
Sure. Yeah.
So that's been a big effort on our part too. So, well, this has been a very nice way for me to spend my Sunday afternoon. I always learn something with every time I do a webinar with somebody. So thank you, Tony, for being with us today. Thank you, Nora, for your introduction with the Hardy Plant Society. Thanks to everybody who joined in.
Thanks for having me.
Absolutely.
Thanks everybody for coming.
Absolutely. Hope to see you all in person in the very near future. And yeah, that's it. Have a great rest of your Sunday, and Tony will be in touch, and Nora, you too.
All right.
All right.
Thanks a lot.
Everybody.
Bye, everybody.
Bye-bye.